In project management, we absolutely live and die by the schedule. But, what happens when the work on the ground doesn't, follow the plan? We're going to talk about something called out-of-sequence progress. It's a super common challenge that can really turn a solid forecast into a total mess. So, how do we deal with it? Let's dive right in.
So, first up, let me ask you something. When you hear that a part of your project is running ahead of schedule, what's your gut reaction? It's probably relief, right? Like, finally, some good news. But what if I told you that same good news can actually introduce some massive risks and completely distort your project forecast? Yeah, that's the real dilemma we're digging into today.
Okay, to make this crystal clear, let's just step away from the job site for a minute. Imagine you're baking a cake. The recipe is simple. First, you sift the flour, then you mix in the eggs. But you're feeling impatient, so you decide to jump the gun and start mixing the eggs while the flour is still being sifted. Now, you're definitely working, you're busy, but are you really saving any time? Or are you just creating a whole different kind of problem for yourself down the line? That right there is the essence of out-of-sequence work.
All right, so let's put a proper name on this unplanned shortcut. What exactly is out-of-sequence progress? Because it's actually a lot more than just changing the order of things. It has some really specific and honestly critical implications for your entire project schedule.
So here's the textbook definition, plain and simple. It's any activity that kicks off before its planned predecessor is 100% done. And let me tell you, this happens constantly, especially on big, complex projects. And the danger is, if you don't account for it the right way, your whole understanding of the project's critical path can be, completely thrown off. Let's look at a super simple, logical plan. You know, how things are supposed to work. First, you have to excavate the foundations. You got to dig the hole. Only after that's totally finished can you move on to pouring the concrete. It's a classic finish-to-start relationship. It's clean, it makes perfect sense, and it's how we build our baseline schedules. But then reality hits, right? The crew on site sees that, hey, one corner of the excavation is totally done. So to keep busy and keep things moving, they start pouring concrete right there. So the pour concrete activity has officially started, even though its predecessor, excavate foundations, is nowhere near complete. This is the perfect picture of that gap between the plan and what's actually happening on the ground.
Now, it's really easy to look at that and just call it a mistake, right? That they're not following the plan. But actually, a lot of the time, there are some pretty smart, totally legitimate reasons why work happens out of sequence. It's just a normal part of getting big, complicated projects done.
I mean, think about it from a practical standpoint. A crew might start early just to avoid standing around waiting. That makes sense. Or maybe a team wants to tackle a small piece of the work just to get a feel for the job ahead. And hey, sometimes the original plan was just plain wrong, and the team on the ground found a much better, more efficient way to do things. The key takeaway here is this. If the work can move forward, it usually will. Okay, so if we know this is going to happen, how in the world do we deal with it in our schedule? Well, this is where your scheduling software, something like Primavera P6, steps in and gives you a really critical choice. It's a single setting that can dramatically change your project's entire forecast, and it all comes down to a tale of two different logics. You've got two main options here, progress override and retained logic. And you can think of it like this. Progress override is basically saying, just show me what's actually happening on site, even if it totally breaks the rules of the plan. Retained logic, on the other hand, is the strict one. It says, nope, the original plan and its rules still matter, and we have to honor them no matter what happens. So let's look at progress override first. When you choose this setting, the software essentially just severs the link to that unfinished predecessor. It just ignores it. This lets the out-of-sequence activity go ahead and finish early, which then pulls all the following activities forward in the schedule. So yeah, it reflects what's happening on the ground, but it completely shatters your original logic. Now contrast that with retained logic, it's a totally different story. Here, the software sees the early start, and it'll even show the progress being made. But, and this is the absolute key, it will not allow that activity to be marked as complete until its original predecessor is finally finished. It basically puts the activity in a holding pattern, which means none of the successor activities can be pulled forward. The original logic stays intact.
Okay, so you've got two very different options, and they create two completely different forecasts. So how do you choose? And more importantly, what do you do when neither option feels quite right? Well, this is where the real art and skill of being a scheduler comes into play.
So let's just lay out the trade-offs nice and clear.
progress override, its advantage is that it reflects what's actually happening out in the field, and it means less manual work for you. The big disadvantage? It can totally undermine your planned logic and even hide what your true critical path is. Then you have retained logic. It's often preferred in contracts because it preserves that intended sequence. The downside is that your schedule might not reflect reality, and it can show durations that are way longer than what's actually happening.
And here's the real kicker. Sometimes this choice is actually made for you. A lot of contracts will explicitly forbid you from using progress override. They demand that the schedule's original logic stays intact, period. In those cases, or just when the software's automated logic gets way too messy, you've got no choice. You have to roll up your sleeves and get in there and make some manual corrections yourself.
So, what's in your manual toolkit for a fix like this? Well, you've actually got a few really powerful options. You could modify the logic itself, maybe switch to something like a finish-to-finish relationship. You could take a big activity and split it into smaller, more manageable parts. Or, hey, if the original plan was just flawed from the start, you can resequence that whole part of the network to reflect the smarter way the team is actually working.
You know, this whole conversation brings us to a much bigger point about what a project scheduler's real job is. It isn't about creating some perfect, rigid plan that never, ever changes. It's about learning how to manage the inevitable chaos of a real-world project.
I absolutely love this quote because it just hits the nail on the head. Your responsibility isn't to prevent things like this from happening. You can't. Your job is to correctly interpret them. You have to be a bit of a detective, figure out why it happened, understand the impact, and then adjust the schedule so it's still a useful and, most importantly, an accurate forecasting tool for what's coming next.
So the big takeaway here is this. An accurate schedule is a living, breathing document. It's not some rigid script that has to be followed no matter what. The goal isn't to force reality to bend to your plan. The goal is to make sure your plan adapts to reality so it can still guide you effectively to that finish line.
And that really leaves us with one final important question to think about for your own projects. The next time you look at your schedule, ask yourself, what am I really looking at here? Is it just a picture of the original plan, how we wished things would go? Or is it an accurate, honest forecast of the real path ahead? Because trust me, the answer to that question makes all the difference. Thanks for joining me.